Before diving into this story that will touch your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell to never miss our most moving tales. If you love stories that touch the soul and extraordinary destinies, this channel is made for you. Click the subscribe button now. It's free and helps us enormously to continue offering you these wonderful tales. Make yourself comfortable, prepare your tissues, and let yourself be carried away by this extraordinary story that will mark you forever. Chapter 1. The Duke buried his last hope for an heir, until the nursemaid left a baby at his door. The autumn of 1863 draped Ravenswood Castle in a melancholy that seemed to seep into every stone of the ancient Yorkshire estate. Duke Edward de Ravenswood, 54 years old, moved through the grand halls of his ancestral home like a ghost haunting his own existence, his footsteps echoing in chambers that had once resounded with laughter, but now contained only the oppressive silence of profound grief. 3 weeks had passed since Duchess Matilda had breathed her last, succumbing to complications following the birth of their first child, and the Duke found himself drowning in a sorrow so deep it threatened to consume what remained of his shattered existence. Edward was 45 years old, a man in the prime of life who had possessed everything the world could offer: immeasurable wealth, a title dating back several centuries, vast estates spanning 3 counties, and most precious of all, a wife whose beauty was equalled only by the gentleness of her spirit and the generosity of her heart. Matilda had been his childhood companion, his dearest friend, his passionate lover and devoted wife, for 8 blissful years of marriage. Her death had torn from him not only a beloved partner, but the very foundations upon which his happiness and sense of duty had been built. The baby, a fragile son they had named Charles, in honor of Edward's grandfather, lay in the nursery under the care of a succession of wet nurses who came and went with alarming frequency. The child seemed to sense the tragedy that had marked his entry into the world, crying incessantly with a wail that pierced through the thick walls of the castle and reached even into Edward's study, where the Duke sought refuge in expensive whiskey and bitter memories. Every cry was a reminder of the price paid for the child's life, every whimper an accusation that Edward could barely bear. "Your Grace," ventured Mrs. Hartwell, the elderly housekeeper who had served the family for 30 years, "the baby hasn't taken well to the new nurse either. That's the 4th one this month, and little Master Charles grows weaker each day. Perhaps we should send for a specialist from London." Edward looked up from the letter he was writing with trembling hands, the 20th attempt to compose something coherent to his late wife's parents. His eyes, once bright with intelligence and warmth, had become dull pools of anguish that seemed to contain no spark of the vital man he had once been. "Do whatever you think best, Mrs. Hartwell," he replied in that hollow voice that had become his norm. I cannot bear to look at him. Every time I see that child, I see her face, and I remember what his life cost." This terrible confession hung in the air between them like a dark cloud. Mrs. Hartwell, who had helped raise Edward from childhood and loved him like her own son, felt her heart break anew as she witnessed his complete spiritual collapse. She understood his pain. Indeed, she had wept privately for hours over the loss of sweet Lady Matilda. But she also knew that somewhere within this devastated man lay the strength to heal, if only he could find a reason to try. The October rain that had been falling steadily for days seemed to echo the Duke's inner storms, drumming against the diamond-paned windows with a persistence that matched his grief. It was on such an evening, as Edward sat alone in his darkened study, with only the dying fire for company, that an unexpected sound cut through the oppressive silence of the castle. Firm and determined knocks at the great front door. Mrs. Hartwell, surprised by a visitor calling at such an hour during the family's period of mourning, made her way to the entrance hall with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Social protocol dictated that the house should not receive visitors, but something in the persistence of the knocking suggested urgency rather than mere social obligation. When she opened the heavy oak door, she discovered a sight that would remain etched in her memory forever. A young woman stood on the threshold, drenched by the driving rain, but holding her head high with remarkable dignity despite her obvious distress. She appeared to be no more than 25, with dark auburn hair plastered to her head and clothes that, while well made, had clearly seen better days. But what struck Mrs. Hartwell most was not the woman's bedraggled appearance, but the expression in her deep green eyes, a combination of desperation and determination that spoke of someone who had come to this door as her last hope. "Please," said the young woman, her voice clear and educated despite the chattering of her teeth, "I must speak to His Grace. I know this is highly irregular, given the recent tragedy, and I would not presume to disturb him if the matter were not of the utmost urgency. My name is Catherine Pembroke, and I believe I might be able to help with the difficulties regarding the baby." Mrs. Hartwell's eyebrows rose in surprise. News of the child's troubles had been carefully contained within the household, yet this stranger spoke as if she possessed some knowledge of the situation. "I'm afraid His Grace is not receiving visitors, miss," she began diplomatically, "and I cannot imagine how you could have heard. I was the late Duchess's personal maid." "You," Catherine interrupted gently, "before her marriage. I served her from childhood until she wed the Duke, and she was more like a sister to me than an employer. I was working in a household in London when I learned of her passing and the baby's difficulties. I have some experience with troubled infants, and I couldn't bear the thought that her child might suffer when I might be able to help." This revelation changed everything. Mrs. Hartwell remembered the devoted lady's maid, who had been such a comfort to Lady Matilda during her youth, though the girl had left for London when her mistress no longer needed her services. The housekeeper's expression softened as she recognized in this rain-soaked Catherine someone who had truly loved the late Duchess and might indeed possess special skills that could help the failing child. "Come in immediately, child," said Mrs. Hartwell, stepping aside to admit the unexpected visitor. "You'll catch your death in this weather. Let me get you dried and fed. Then we'll see about speaking to His Grace, though I warn you, he hasn't been himself since the tragedy." Catherine entered the warm grandeur of Ravenswood Castle with a mixture of awe and sorrow. She had never seen the Duke's home during her years of service to Lady Matilda, but she could imagine her beloved mistress moving through these magnificent rooms, bringing light and joy to every corner. Now the castle felt like a tomb, beautiful but lifeless, as if all happiness had departed with the woman who had once been its heart. As Mrs. Hartwell led her toward the servants' quarters to be warmed and fed, Catherine's trained ear caught the sound that had driven her to undertake this desperate journey. The weak and pitiful cries of a child who was clearly in distress. Her heart clenched in pain as she recognized in that sound the voice of Lady Matilda's child, the baby who represented all that remained of the woman who had been like family to her. "The baby," said Catherine, stopping in the corridor. "How long has he been crying like this?" "Almost constantly for days," replied Mrs. Hartwell with weary sadness. "Nothing we do seems to comfort him. He won't take milk properly from any of the wet nurses, and each day he grows thinner and weaker. The doctors say—" She stopped, unwilling to voice the grim prognosis. "May I see him?" asked Catherine with quiet urgency. "Perhaps there's something. Lady Matilda always said I had a gift with troubled babies. I helped care for her young cousins when they were infants." Mrs. Hartwell hesitated, knowing such a request was highly irregular, but something in Catherine's manner convinced her that this young woman might indeed possess the help they so desperately needed. "Very well," she decided, But first let me find you dry clothes. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from pneumonia." 20 minutes later, dressed in borrowed servant's clothes that were too large but blessedly dry, Catherine followed Mrs. Hartwell up the grand staircase toward the nursery wing. With each step, the baby's cries grew louder and more heartrending, a sound that seemed to embody all the grief and loss that had struck this once happy house. When they reached the nursery, Catherine's heart nearly broke at the sight that greeted her. A beautiful room that should have been filled with joy and wonder had become a place of anxiety and failure. The current wet nurse, a capable-looking woman in her 40s, sat holding the tiny Duke Charles with an expression of frustrated defeat. "He won't take the milk, ma'am," the nurse said to Mrs. Hartwell. "I've tried everything I know, but he just pushes it away and cries harder. I fear he simply wasn't meant for this world." Catherine approached slowly, her heart aching as she saw the tiny infant with his red face, who so strikingly resembled his departed mother. Without asking permission, she reached out her arms toward the baby, and to everyone's amazement, the wet nurse found herself handing over the child as if compelled by some unseen force. The moment Catherine took little Charles in her arms, something magical seemed to happen. Her voice, soft and melodious, began to hum a lullaby that Lady Matilda had loved, a tender air that seemed to resonate with some deep memory in the baby's consciousness. Gradually, incredibly, the crying began to subside, replaced by the hiccuping sobs of an infant finding comfort at last after long suffering. "There now, precious," Catherine murmured, rocking the baby with practiced skill. "Your mama loved you so much, and she's still watching over you. You're safe now, little lord. You're going to be just fine." As if responding to some primitive recognition of true care and love, baby Charles nestled against Catherine's chest, and for the first time in days seemed truly peaceful. The transformation was so immediate and complete that Mrs. Hartwell and the wet nurse watched in amazement at this miracle they were witnessing. It was at this moment that Edward, drawn by the unusual silence where crying had been constant, appeared in the nursery doorway and witnessed a scene that would change his life forever. A young woman he didn't recognize, holding his son with such tender love that the child had finally found peace, and in her gentle care, perhaps his only hope for survival. Chapter 2. The Healing Touch. Duke Edward Ashworth froze in the nursery doorway, his hand gripping the frame so tightly that his knuckles appeared white against the polished wood. For 3 weeks he had avoided this room, unable to bear the sight of the child whose birth had cost him everything he cherished. Yet now he found himself transfixed by the extraordinary scene unfolding before him. This mysterious young woman, whom he had never seen before, held his son with such natural tenderness that little Charles had fallen into the first peaceful sleep he had known since entering this world of sorrow. "Who is this woman?" Edward asked in a voice barely above a whisper, his eyes never leaving the gentle tableau of Catherine cradling his son. Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward nervously, aware that she had taken considerable liberties in allowing a stranger access to the nursery without the Duke's permission. "Your Grace, this is Miss Catherine Pembroke. She was Lady Matilda's personal maid before your marriage. She came here tonight, having heard of the baby's difficulties, believing she might be able to help." At the mention of his late wife's name, Edward's jaw tightened and a flash of pain crossed his features, yet he could not deny what his own eyes witnessed. His son, who had cried incessantly for days and refused to take nourishment from anyone, lay now peacefully in this woman's arms, as if he recognized in her the mother fate had chosen for him. "How?" Edward asked, stepping reluctantly into the room, drawn despite himself by this inexplicable transformation of his child's condition. Catherine looked up to meet the Duke's gaze for the first time, and her heart constricted with sympathy at what she saw there. This was a man hollowed out by grief, his fine features aged by suffering beyond his years, his dark eyes containing depths of pain that seemed almost unbearable to witness. She understood now why Lady Mathilde had loved him so deeply. Beneath the current mask of anguish lay evidence of the intelligent and compassionate man her mistress had described in her letters. "Babies perceive our emotions more acutely than we realize, Your Grace," Catherine responded softly, her voice carefully modulated to avoid disturbing the sleeping infant. "Little Charles has been surrounded by grief and anxiety since his birth. He needed someone to hold him with joy rather than sorrow, with hope rather than fear. Lady Mathilde would have wanted him to feel loved, not blamed for her passing." These words, spoken with gentle conviction, struck Edward like physical blows. He staggered slightly, gripping a nearby chair as the truth of her observation sank into his consciousness. In his overwhelming grief, he had indeed blamed the child for his wife's death, had seen in the baby's face only the reminder of his devastating loss, rather than the miracle of new life that should be celebrated. "I cannot," Edward began, his voice breaking with emotion. "Every time I see him, I remember. I cannot separate the joy of his existence from the agony of losing her." "You don't have to forget your grief to love your son," Catherine said with surprising authority for someone speaking to a duke. "Lady Mathilde gave her life to bring him into this world because she believed he was worth that sacrifice. To deny him love now would make her death meaningless. She would want you to see in him not her end, but her greatest gift to you." The wet nurse and Mrs. Hartwell exchanged meaningful glances, both recognizing that this young woman possessed not only an extraordinary gift with children, but also the courage and wisdom to speak truths that needed to be heard, regardless of the social gulf between herself and her noble employer. Edward sank heavily into the nursery rocking chair, his head in his hands as years of suppressed emotion finally found release. "I have been such a fool," he murmured. "Such a selfish and blind fool. She died bringing him life, and I have spent these weeks wishing he had never been born." "Grief makes us all mad sometimes," Catherine replied with infinite gentleness. "But it's not too late to change. He's still so young, still capable of learning that he is loved and wanted. All he needs is someone willing to see past their own pain to recognize his need for affection." As if summoned by some unconscious signal, baby Charles stirred in Catherine's arms and opened his eyes, eyes that were unmistakably his mother's, the same warm brown that had captivated Edward during their courtship. But instead of seeing the accusation he had imagined, Edward now observed only the innocent trust and natural seeking of a child for parental love. May I hold him?" Edward asked hesitantly, as if requesting permission to embrace his own son. Catherine rose gracefully and moved toward the Duke, carefully transferring the infant into his trembling arms. "Support his head like this," she instructed gently, "and speak to him. He knows your voice from hearing it in his mother's womb." For a moment, Edward simply stared at the small being in his arms, overwhelmed by the reality of fatherhood he had denied. "Hello, Charles," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I am your father. I'm sorry I haven't been here for you. I promise I will try to do better." The baby looked at him with that unfocused attention of newborns, but there was something in the child's expression that seemed to recognize this important moment. Catherine watched with tears in her eyes as she witnessed the beginning of the bond between father and son that should have formed at birth, but had been delayed by the Duke's overwhelming grief. "He is beautiful," Edward said with wonder, as if seeing his child clearly for the first time. "He has her eyes, but his chin, that's from my family line." "He's going to be a handsome man," Catherine agreed, "and with proper care and love, he'll grow to be someone both you and Lady Matilde would be proud of." At that moment, as if to validate this hopeful prediction, baby Charles yawned and settled more comfortably in his father's arms, clearly content to remain there. Mrs. Hartwell dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, moved by this touching scene of reconciliation between the Duke and his heir. "Miss Pembroke," Edward said, without taking his eyes from his son, would you consent to remain at Ravenswood to help with Charles? It's clear that you have skills with children that we desperately need, and I would be grateful for your guidance as I learn to be the father he deserves." Catherine's heart leapt at this unexpected opportunity to remain close to Lady Matilda's child and help ensure his well-being. "I would be honoured, Your Grace. Lady Matilda meant everything to me, and caring for her son would be a privilege, not a duty." "Then it's settled," Edward decided with the first note of decisive authority he had shown since his wife's death. "Mrs. Hartwell, please prepare suitable quarters for Miss Pembroke near the nursery. She shall serve as Charles's primary nurse and governess, with whatever assistance she requires." As the small group made arrangements for Catherine's permanent residence at Ravenswood Castle, none of them could have predicted that this night would mark not only the salvation of baby Charles, but the beginning of a relationship between the grieving Duke and the compassionate young woman that would eventually heal both hearts and transform their understanding of what family could mean. The baby stirred again in his father's arms, and this time Edward responded not with pain, but with wonder at the small miracle he held, a miracle that Catherine had helped him recognize and embrace. In her gentle intervention, father and son had found exactly what they both needed: hope for the future and the beginning of healing for wounds that had seemed too deep to mend. Chapter 3. The Blossoming of Hearts. The months that followed Catherine's arrival at Ravenswood Castle brought a transformation so profound that visitors to the estate could scarcely believe it was the same household that had been shrouded in such devastating grief. Under Catherine's devoted care, baby Charles thrived as only a truly loved child can, becoming plump and healthy while developing that bright alertness that comes from secure attachment and constant affection. But perhaps even more remarkable was the gradual healing of the Duke himself, who slowly emerged from his cocoon of sorrow to reclaim his roles as both father and master of his domain. Catherine had settled into her new life at Ravenswood with the efficient gratitude of someone who had finally found her true calling. Her quarters, a comfortable suite adjacent to the nursery, became the warm center of the baby's world, filled with the gentle sounds of lullabies, soft conversation, and the contented coos of an infant who knew himself cherished. She approached her duties with the perfect combination of professional competence and genuine love, treating little Charles not merely as another charge to manage, but as the precious legacy of the woman who had meant everything to her. Edward found himself drawn to the nursery wing with increasing frequency, initially using the excuse of checking on his son's welfare, but gradually acknowledging to himself that Catherine's presence had become a source of comfort and peace he desperately craved. There was something remarkably soothing about watching her with Charles, the way she could calm his cries with just a few soft words, how she anticipated his needs before he could even express them, the natural grace with which she moved through the routines of infant care that had seemed so mysterious and overwhelming to everyone else. "She has a gift," Mrs. Hartwell confided to the estate steward one evening. "It's not just that she knows babies, though she certainly does. It's that she truly loves our little master as if he were her own, and his grace. Well, I haven't seen him smile so easily since before Lady Matilda's passing. Indeed, Edward was discovering that his conversations with Catherine had become the highlights of his days. What had begun as simple discussions about Charles's feeding schedule and developmental progress had evolved into extended talks about literature, music, philosophy, and the complex emotional landscape of grief and healing. Catherine possessed an educated mind that could engage with his own intellectual interests. But more importantly, she had an intuitive understanding of the human heart that helped him navigate the treacherous waters of his grieving process. "Do you think it's wrong of me to sometimes feel happy?" Edward asked one evening as they sat in the nursery, watching Charles practice his newly acquired ability to grasp colourful toys. "When I laugh at something you've said, or feel genuine pleasure watching him discover the world, I feel as though I'm betraying Matilda's memory." Catherine considered this carefully before responding, her fingers gently stroking the baby's silky hair as he rested peacefully on her lap. "I think Lady Matilda would be heartbroken to know that her death had stolen all joy from your life forever," she replied thoughtfully. "She loved you deeply. I saw how her face would light up when she spoke of you. Don't you think she would want you to find happiness again, especially in loving the child you created together?" This perspective, delivered with Catherine's characteristic blend of gentleness and wisdom, helped Edward begin to separate his grief for his wife from his growing attachment to his son. He was beginning to see that honoring Matilda's memory didn't require perpetual sadness, but rather the cultivation of the love and joy she had brought into his life, now redirected toward the precious child who carried her legacy forward. As winter melted into spring, Edward noticed other changes in himself that could only be attributed to Catherine's influence. Her natural optimism and quiet strength seemed to counterbalance his tendency toward melancholy, while her practical compassion gave him a model for engaging with the world beyond his own grief. She had a way of listening that made him feel truly heard, and her responses to his questions and concerns revealed a depth of insight he found increasingly invaluable. Catherine, for her part, was fighting her own battle, a growing awareness that her feelings for the Duke had evolved far beyond professional respect or even friendship. She found herself looking forward to their evening conversations with an anticipation that had nothing to do with discussing baby Charles, and she caught herself watching Edward's face for signs of returning happiness with an intensity that far exceeded concern for her employer's well-being. The realization that she was falling in love with him filled her with both joy and terror, as she understood perfectly the impossibility of such feelings. The gulf between their social stations was vast and unbridgeable by conventional standards. She was a servant, however esteemed and valued, while he was a duke whose eventual remarriage would necessarily involve considerations of lineage, wealth, and social advantage that no personal compatibility could overcome. To allow herself to hope for anything beyond her current position would be the height of folly. Yet she found it increasingly difficult to guard her heart against the growing affection she felt for this complicated, wounded, fundamentally good man who had become the center of her world. Their relationship might have continued indefinitely in this state of unacknowledged mutual attraction, disguised as professional cooperation, if not for an incident that forced both of them to confront the true nature of their feelings. It happened on a particularly beautiful evening in May, when Edward had joined Catherine in the garden, where she often took Charles for fresh air and sunshine. The baby, now nearly 8 months old, was sitting on a blanket attempting to crawl, while Catherine and Edward sat on a nearby bench, ostensibly supervising his efforts, but actually deeply engaged in conversation about a book they had both recently read. "I should return to the house," Catherine said reluctantly as the sun began to set. "Charles needs his evening feeding, and I want to give him a bath before bedtime." As she rose to gather the baby, her foot caught in the edge of the blanket, causing her to stumble. Edward's reflexes, sharpened by years of riding and hunting, triggered instantly, and he caught her in his arms, pulling her against his chest to prevent her fall. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they remained frozen in this intimate embrace, her hands pressed against his chest, his arms wrapped securely around her waist, their faces only inches apart. The awareness that crackled between them in that moment was impossible to ignore or misinterpret. Catherine felt her breath catch as she looked up into Edward's dark eyes and saw there not just gratitude or friendship, but unmistakable desire. Edward, for his part, felt as though he was awakening from a long dream to discover that the woman in his arms had become essential to his happiness in ways that far exceeded her care for his son. "Catherine," he murmured, her name on his lips like a prayer. "Your Grace," she responded breathlessly, but made no attempt to step away from his embrace. They might have kissed then. Indeed, every fibre of their being seemed to pull them toward that inevitable conclusion. But baby Charles chose that moment to let out an indignant cry at being temporarily forgotten, breaking the spell and reminding them both of their respective roles and responsibilities. Catherine stepped back quickly, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and confusion. The baby needs—" "Of course," Edward agreed, though his own voice was unsteady. "We should get him inside." As they gathered Charles and his things, both were acutely aware of the charged atmosphere between them, neither able to deny that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The careful boundaries they had maintained were beginning to crumble under the weight of emotions that could no longer be contained or ignored. That night, as Catherine settled Charles in his crib and prepared for bed, she found herself reliving every second of their near kiss, wondering what would have happened if they hadn't been interrupted, and whether Edward's feelings truly mirrored her own. Meanwhile, in his study, Edward sat staring into the fire, finally admitting to himself that his feelings for Catherine had grown into something that could only be called love. A realization that filled him with equal measures of joy and despair, as he contemplated the seemingly insurmountable obstacles that stood between them and any hope of a shared future. Chapter 4. Love conquers all boundaries. The tension that had developed between Edward and Catherine following their charged moment in the garden created an atmosphere of sweet torment that neither could ignore nor resolve. They found themselves caught between propriety and passion, duty and desire, in a dance of restrained longing that became more difficult to maintain with each passing day. Their conversations became carefully formal, yet their eyes spoke volumes that words couldn't safely express. Edward began avoiding the nursery during Catherine's evening routines, while she found excuses to minimize their private interactions, both attempting to preserve what remained of appropriate boundaries. This careful avoidance might have continued indefinitely if fate hadn't intervened in the form of baby Charles, falling gravely ill with a fever that terrified everyone in the household. The child, who had flourished under Catherine's devoted care, suddenly became listless and hot to the touch, refusing to eat and crying with a weakness that spoke of true distress. Catherine, who had never left his side during the 3 days of his illness, was herself on the verge of collapse from exhaustion and worry when the crisis finally broke. Edward, who had maintained his own vigil outside the nursery, paced the corridor like a caged animal when he heard Catherine's voice call his name, with an urgency that sent ice through his veins. Rushing into the nursery, he found her kneeling beside the baby's crib, tears streaming down her face as she looked at him with eyes full of despair. "His fever has broken," she whispered, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. I think he's going to be all right." The relief that flooded Edward was so intense it buckled his knees, and he collapsed beside Catherine, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch his son's forehead and confirm that the dangerous heat had indeed receded. "Thank God," he breathed. "Thank God, and thank you. You saved him, Catherine. You saved my son." "I couldn't bear to lose him," Catherine sobbed, all her carefully maintained emotional control finally cracking under the strain of the past 3 days. "He's all I have left of her, all that remains of the woman who was like a sister to me. If something had happened to him—" It was Edward's turn to offer comfort, and without thinking of propriety or consequences, he gathered Catherine into his arms, holding her tightly as she wept with the exhausted relief of someone who had fought death and won. "He's safe," Edward murmured against her hair. "He's safe because of you, because of your love and devotion. I don't know what we would have done without you." As Catherine's tears gradually subsided, she became aware of the impropriety of her position. Pressed against the Duke's chest, her defences completely lowered, her heart exposed and vulnerable. She should have stepped away, resumed the proper distance between them, but she found herself unable to move from the circle of his embrace, unable to relinquish the comfort and security she found there. "Catherine," Edward said softly, "I need to tell you something I should have said weeks ago, what I feel for you. It's not gratitude, though I am grateful beyond words. It's not mere friendship, though I treasure your company. It's love, deep and lasting love, that grows stronger every day despite my efforts to contain it." These words, spoken with quiet conviction, broke down the last barriers around Catherine's heart. "Edward," she whispered, using his Christian name for the first time, "I love you too. I've tried to remember my place and your position, but I cannot help myself. You have become everything to me." Their kiss, when it finally came, was worth all the weeks of restraint and uncertainty they had endured. It was tender and passionate, desperate and reverent all at once, the meeting of two souls who had found in each other the missing pieces of their hearts. When they finally parted, both were trembling under the force of emotions too long suppressed. "This is impossible," Catherine said, though she made no attempt to leave his arms. "You are a duke. I am a servant. The world will never accept such a union." "The world," Edward replied firmly, "can go to the devil. I've learned these past months that love is more rare and precious than any social convention. I nearly lost my son because I allowed grief to blind me to what was truly important. I won't make that mistake again with my heart. I love you, Catherine Pembroke, and I want you to be my wife." The proposal, coming so suddenly after months of unspoken feelings, left Catherine speechless with joy and terror. But the scandal, your family, your position in society. "My family consists of you and Charles," Edward said decisively. "My position in society means nothing if I cannot share it with the woman I love. As for scandal, let them talk. I would rather face their whispers with you at my side than endure a life of respectability without you." The weeks that followed this declaration were indeed filled with shock, consternation, and fierce opposition from various quarters. Edward's lawyers warned him of the legal complications of such a marriage. His few remaining relatives expressed their horror at this mésalliance, and London society buzzed with scandalized gossip about the Duke who intended to marry his child's nursemaid. But Edward faced every obstacle with the same determination he had once shown on the hunting field, refusing to be swayed by social pressure or family disapproval. Catherine, for her part, struggled with moments of doubt about the wisdom of accepting his proposal. She understood better than Edward the challenges they would face, the whispers that would follow them, the doors that would close against them. But every time she wavered, she had only to look at baby Charles, thriving, happy, secure in the love of his father and the woman who had become his mother in all but blood, to remember what truly mattered in life. Their wedding, held in the private chapel at Ravenswood Castle 6 months later, was a simple ceremony, attended only by the household staff and a handful of Edward's closest friends who chose loyalty over social convention. Catherine wore a gown of ivory silk that transformed her from nursemaid to duchess with stunning elegance, while Edward watched her with such obvious adoration that even the most cynical observers were moved by the genuine love between them. "Do you, Edward Alexander Ashworth, take Catherine Elizabeth Pembroke to be your lawful wedded wife?" asked the rector, his voice carrying clearly through the small but beautiful appointed chapel. "I do," Edward replied with absolute conviction, his eyes never leaving Catherine's face. "And do you, Catherine Elizabeth Pembroke, take Edward Alexander Ashworth to be your lawful wedded husband?" "I do," Catherine answered, her voice firm despite the tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. When they were pronounced husband and wife, their kiss was witnessed by baby Charles, now a sturdy toddler who clapped his hands with delight from Mrs. Hartwell's arms, perhaps understanding better than the adults around him that this moment marked the completion of their little family. In the years that followed, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenswood proved that love does indeed conquer all boundaries. Catherine grew into her role with grace and dignity that silenced even her harshest critics, while Edward found in their partnership the strength to become not only a better father, but a better man. Their marriage produced 3 more children who grew up with Charles as their beloved elder brother, creating a family united not by obligation or convenience, but by genuine affection and mutual respect. When historians later wrote about the Ashworth family, they noted that the marriage between the Duke and his former nursemaid became legendary not for its initial scandal, but for its lasting happiness and the positive impact it had on the entire estate. Catherine's understanding of common people, combined with Edward's resources and position, led to reforms and improvements that made Ravenswood a model for other great estates throughout England. And at the heart of it all remained the truth that had brought them together in the first place. Sometimes the greatest love comes not from expected places, but from the courage to see beyond social conventions to the heart of what truly matters. In saving baby Charles, Catherine had saved them all, proving that love, when it arrives in unexpected forms, has the power to heal the deepest wounds and create families bound by choice rather than mere circumstance. Thank you for joining us in this moving story that proves love knows no boundaries and that sometimes our greatest blessings come in the most unexpected forms. If this story touched you, subscribe immediately to our channel to discover more touching tales that celebrate the power of love to transform lives and overcome all obstacles. Your next emotional journey awaits.